Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Very British Futures, a podcast dedicated to travelling down some of the lesser known byways of British science fiction television. I'm Gareth Preston and I'm joined by Nigel Anderson and Brian Clark. Nigel is an actor and director for both stage and film, as well as artistic director for the Manchester Indie Filmmakers Group. Brian, writing under the slightly longer name of Brian M. Clark, has been a comics writer for nigh on 40 years. He's also very much involved in theatre, film and magazines. We are inevitably going to feature some spoilers for this show in order to discuss it. The programme is available on DVD from Network Video, which also contains a marvellous series guide written by Andrew Pixley, which has been invaluable in preparing this episode. Today, we're starting with a family drama serial which was both popular and quietly groundbreaking in its day, but until recently has not been generally available to re-watch. Pathfinders in Space and its sequels, Pathfinders to Mars and Pathfinders to Venus. Pathfinders in Space was itself a follow-up to the 1960s Target Luna, which introduced the Buchan Island space project. Its founder, Professor Wedgwood, and his three children, Jeff, Valerie, and Jimmy. An unusual chain of events leads Jimmy to become the first man in space and to orbit the moon, but it requires the efforts of radio operators around the world to bring him safely home. This series, which starred amongst others Frank Finlay and Michael Craze, is sadly missing from the archives. The Pathfinder series was produced by ABC Television and ran for 21 episodes at Sunday tea time between September 1960 and April 1961. Interestingly, the third episode of Pathfinders to Mars, The Hostage, was transmitted on Christmas Day, 1960, and was one of the highest-rated programs of the day. It was initially devised and produced by Sidney Newman, the Canadian television executive who'd go on to become head of drama at the BBC, and directed by the already very experienced stage and TV director Guy Verney. Pathfinders was written by Malcolm Houck and Eric Pace, with some additional contributions from biographer and journalist Ivan Rowe on the Venus episodes. At a time when many children's drama series were still adaptations of classic period books, Sidney Newman had been keen to produce a modern adventure that was both exciting and would encourage children's interest in real science and engineering. And if that phrase sounds a little familiar, that's because it was his initial starting point for his later creation, Doctor Who, a sci-fi drama initially intended to inspire its young audience about science and history. Hello, and welcome to the show.
And I think the first question, which I'm going to direct towards Brian, is how did you first encounter Pathfinder?
It's odd, really, because I was born 1954. So with this initially airing 1960, 61, I don't think I sat down and watched it on the first airing. But before picking up the network DVD set, I was aware of it. So I've seen it somewhere. And I don't know if this was repeated in the later 60s or if I've just seen episodes, various science fiction conventions I've been to. But I had memories of it. But in the best science fiction tradition, I don't know where those memories came from.
Well, for me, I binged watched the series in sort of preparation for this podcast. But I've got to say, it's like the Mamma Mia of science fiction, because it's so bad it's good. The golden rule for me is never say it's science fiction, because people obviously want to hate it before you've even seen it. But there's something very endearing about this series, and the connections with with the sci-fi programs that came out afterwards in the 60s to the 70s. There's so many people who were involved in Pathfinders who went on to do things like Doctor Who. There's a lot of the Terry Nation sort of dramas that came out, the Tripods, all of these series all have connections back somewhere along the line to the Pathfinders. I can't help but admire its ambition when you compare it, because it is the sort of start and the basis of what was going to lead up to Doctor Who. And if you think about the actual history of it, the timeline, Sidney Newman was only, released from ABC in 62, and Doctor Who starts in 63. So, he was the man that really sort of came along and started to shake things up for British TV. He said, we want more action. We don't want this very stilted style of acting. We want people to be more natural. And he gets people to engage with the characters. You can't but help by the end of the series, you're literally cheering these guys on to succeed. It's incredible. But somebody watching it now, you've got to have comparisons to the science fiction we have today and the production levels we have today. But it keeps you watching. I quite have to say there's like good and bad moments in it. But overall, I don't think they had as many edit cuts. In Doctor Who, they only were allowed 4 edits per episode.
Yes, it was planned to be filmed live. In fact, if possible, they only had the one cut, which was for the ad break. And otherwise, they tried to just go straight through the first act and then straight through the second act, unless something catastrophic happened.
Well, that's exactly as I understand it. They filmed it as live, and only if a piece of property fell down or somebody just completely messed up their lines would they stop. So you are left with these polystyrene boulders just falling out when they shouldn't, or microphones dipping into shots, or people moving around in the background getting ready to appear in the next scene. We will, I assume, get onto this later. There was an episode with deliberate mistakes in it.
Well, now you brought it up, I think it's worth mentioning it in one episode.
Episode 7 of Venus.
Thank you very much. Yes, episode 7, the Valley of Monsters. They deliberately put in 8 errors, including booms waving into shot and people, to see, as part of an experiment, to see if children noticed it, and it sort of took them out of the drama. And in this case, it turned out largely it didn't. Although the children did sometimes notice them, they generally accepted it as part of making a TV program. In fact, that was one of the findings they found out, that children were actually a lot more sophisticated in their understanding of how a television series is made than perhaps the grown-ups gave them credit for.
Yes, absolutely.
Personally, I hadn't heard about Pathfinders until I bought Jeremy Bentham's Doctor Who: The Early Years, which has a chapter on Pathfinders in Space, so it quite intrigued me from his synopsizing, and particularly the character of Harcourt Brown. It's a program of its time. I think, looking at it now, it's there had been other science fiction shows on before it, particularly children's. There was a popular series which I remember you, Brian. I'd like to hear a bit more about the Lost Planet, which ultimately ran to six books.
Yeah, and I have 2 of them here, which I know is useless for audio, but at least
Brian is showing me a couple of there's a couple of splendid looking hardbacks with battered dust covers here.
Yes, well used. And what I loved about reading A Lost World, which is firmly juvenile fiction, is its idea of space exploration was still World War II RAF. And it was really just a small group of people. In this case, a family relative just builds a spaceship, and they hear about this planet, Ahesus, approaching the Earth. They go off and they land on it, and they have adventures, and they do that in subsequent books as well. But it was this idea that it was almost like taking a taxi. And one of the amazing things in the Lost Planet books is when they arrive there, one of the first things they do, they ask the lady going along with them to prepare them some breakfast, and they have bacon and eggs fried on this planet. And there's a similar reference to that in the early episode of Pathfinders in Space, because when they land on the moon, they also sit down with tin cups to have a hot drink as they make their plan.
Also, I draw on the work of Robert Heinlein, the American sci-fi author, who wrote a series of books in a similar way to Sidney Newman, intended to kind of inspire young teenage boys and girls.
Again, totally useless on a podcast. But I have about my person one of his early books, which is The Red Planet, which again comes under the juvenile range that he was writing in his early years. It is very much like Angus MacVicar in style. But I think America took science fiction far more seriously than we did in Britain. That's just my general opinion of it. But
certainly Heinlein's books are all about very competent, capable individuals who seize their own destiny and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's
one of the big differences, though, especially 50s and 60s sci-fi between America and the UK. UK SF tended to veer on the dystopian, and it dealt with the problems of scientific progress. And American science fiction tended to celebrate scientific progress. And it's interesting that both Heinlein and MacVicar came from an engineering background, and they saw space travel as an engineering issue. And if you solve the issues of building, there's also another reference with UK science fiction and juvenile fiction, and that's Patrick Moore, who wrote dozens and dozens of juvenile SF. I'm trying to think the name of his main character. Was it Kelso?
I do have the books.
I have read one of his I have read one of his sci-fi novels, but I cannot for life remember the title. My main memory of it was my slight annoyance was that the hero kept falling unconscious at moments of drama, having just been taught in English about that is a terrible way to that's something you should avoid in writing.
Yes, it's almost like and then I woke up.
And then exactly and then I woke up school.
Again, I would compare Patrick Moore's style of writing to a juvenile sort of scenario. Interestingly, he wrote a book which is quite difficult to get hold of now. It's called The Wheel in Space, which so happens to be a Doctor Who story in 1967 or something like that. But it's all about espionage and people trying to stop this wheel in space being built. And it carries on. And I feel that somehow 60s and 70s literature really didn't move on a great deal in its content, whereas the American writers were writing usually about, I mean, if we take Starship Troopers, which is another the sort of Heinlein sort of classic, it's the most misunderstood film of our generation. But it's not particularly, when you start to read it, all right, it's in a spaceship, they're being parachuted down to this site where they're going to absolutely obliterate all these aliens, but it doesn't particularly feel like a science fiction novel. But it is misunderstood because there's so many sort of hidden messages in it. And this was the theme running through a lot of 60s and 70s TV. If it wasn't about, I suppose, discrimination and, other topics, I mean, Greenpeace, things like that. Hulk was classically writing about issues. I can see that this was a bit of I can't understand why there was a big gap between Hulk writing Pathfinders and him coming on board for Doctor Who, because he died, I think, in '79.
Yeah, it does it, because obviously he works with Sidney Newman. I can only assume he had better offers in between the end of Pathfinder.
They might have paid more, probably. But
well, he went on to Avengers, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
I think that could have been. He could have been too busy with Avengers and No Hiding Place and other sort of policeman shows for a while before coming back for the Faceless Ones. Now, whilst Malcolm Houck and Eric Pace, they didn't come from an engineering background. They certainly did their research. They took it quite seriously. They read a lot of New Scientist and other books of the time, and certainly Pathfinder Space is determinedly more in that kind of that phrase hard sci-fi, trying to take it seriously. Of course, the trouble with taking it seriously is that it rather shows in sharp relief when it's incredibly silly, unfortunately, because on one level it's very serious. We get a lot of conversations about the mathematics of firing rockets and how they need to get the planets in the right they can only do it at certain times so that the planets are near enough, and how rockets are made, how rockets work and all that. So there's all that research is there between the characters, but set against that is the fact that the Buchan Island rocket group is a pretty shambolic affair in many ways, and the contrivances.
Yes. Because the number of times they go out of that control room, Gareth, is incredible, and just leave the phone on.
Yeah,
leave everything a bit to chance, isn't it? But that's drama. That's drama, Gareth.
That is it.
Elaborate, can't you?
That's the need to get the children involved. Unfortunately, leads to some extreme contrivances that Professor Wedgwood just does not believe in the Plan B. Sort of like
just like his involvement with Doctor Who, Newman's when he wrote the series Bible for this, he wanted this to be an educational series, and his stipulation is the only locations they can go to must be within the solar system. He didn't want invented planets. He didn't want fantastical things happening. And that in itself, unless you fantasize it by going underground or finding mysterious jungle worlds, it limits what you can actually do with it.
It does. It's certainly for a children's series. Plus, at this time, man was still Yuri Gagarin would not be going into space for another year yet. So for most of this series, manned spaceflight is still an unknown. Nobody knows what will happen.
Well, it's romantic, isn't it? Well, it is a romantic vision of what space is. And that's where the literature of the 50s comes in, really, because it's this romantic view that, space travel is so easy. We can reach other planets and other solar systems. And we know now that we can't without a great deal of technological advance or finding some way of propelling ourselves quick enough through space to get to other solar systems. Let's just make a comparison here, if we can, because Ray Bradbury, who is another of the great sci-fi writers, wrote The Martian Chronicles. Now, he wrote that in 1958, and yet he set it, in a very surreal Mars. It wasn't until the 1970s, I don't think, before it became a mini-series. And I don't think anybody understood it when it was aired. It's never become the cult classic. Yeah.
No, he was very much aiming this at, the man. He was very keen on what he called plain-speaking drama.
Can I just say that on that interface of science as it was known then and science as it has turned out, and here's a spoiler alert for the third story, Pathfinders on Venus. So you might want to go forward about a minute here. But Wilson is on a secret mission. And we don't find out till episode 8 what his secret mission is when the Russians land. And his secret mission was to do with telecommunications. And it's only a year after this that Telstar goes up.
Right.
So you're in a world where you don't have satellites and telecommunications and that. And so he's on the threshold of it. But within a year, he's overtaken by real world events.
And yet, incredibly, there are some very sort of precise scientific reasoning coming out from, especially in Pathfinders to Mars. I thought the actual depiction on Mars was pretty good. You know, it was very rocky. And they're talking about the storms, the canals, you know, and all this. I thought, despite that they're going around the set about 15 times, you know, and trying to angle it so it looks slightly different each time, it was a pretty good description, or a visual description of Mars for 1960.
Even with the plastic inflatable lichen.
Yeah. I thought that was a nice. I thought that was one of the nice extrapolations, and there are a few extrapolations which science fiction still does to this day, in that there might be some lichen. We're going to slightly exaggerate it and have it as giant monster lichen.
Yes.
Although nicely, it's still kind of acting like lichen. The only reason it seeks people not because it's in any way evil or sentient or anything daft like that. It's simply seeking humans because we're full of water, as Mary Meadows points out, which is another nice thing.
Except she then points out a few minutes later that they're full of water.
That's it.
Because it becomes their source of water.
That's quite clever. In fact, I think the lichens are an interesting, a good way of bringing in a bit of threat to the series without having to cheat and stick some Martians, some actual Martians.
The genius of Newman is not to have any monsters in it as such, because obviously we've talked about the American influences, but I mean, most monsters in sci-fi films and serials was a man in a rubber suit running around chasing people, and infamously Newman says to Verity Lambert, "No BEMs, no bug-eyed monsters," and he's sidestepped that, because let's look at the performances of the individuals, Gerald Flood, etc. They do it with such straight faces. I can't. You know, there must have been moments when they were trying not to laugh or sort of break down in front of the camera. But it was such a polished performance. And the actual setup of each episode, I think, is very much in a theatre style. But we're in a sort of position now where we've got the luxury of, you know, very nicely equipped studios. We've got better equipment, more sophisticated technology. Back then, these people were doing it in old cinemas, old theatres, which had probably been, you know, damaged in the war. And, you know, I think very close to us, actually, unfortunately, it's no longer there, is a cinema in Didsbury. And they did Armchair Theatre from there for the first couple of years. And that was an ABC production, and I think Sidney Newman was involved with that. But
he was involved. He didn't create it, but he certainly involved in revitalising it and bringing in a lot of new young writers like Harold Pinter into it. So I think that's another one of his big achievements. So talking about the performances, there's no doubt Gerald Flood in the first one, and it's not surprising that he's the one who stays, and Professor Wedgwood is quickly invalided out for the rest of the series because it's a very British step up on there. Come on, cheer. We've got to stay positive, chaps. Can
I just say, in that first series, Pathfinders in Space, he plays the part of a journalist, and I love the scene where they've landed on the moon, and one of the first things he does, he takes out his typewriter and starts to type up his news report to send back to his newspaper in London,
which is splendidly dedicated to his cause. It's interesting. They largely kind of drop the journalism side of him
Yeah.
in the subsequent story. There's a bit about he's sending a radio broadcast back at the start of Pathfinders to Venus, but he pretty much becomes a science hero.
Yeah.
And a test. It turned out in Target Luna, I didn't realize this until I read the notes, that he had actually been a pilot and an engineer working on experimental planes, and then went into journalism.
They do mention that in the first episode of Pathfinders in Space. They say about him having this background, which is why he can come along on the trip.
It's one of those stretching of facts.
Yes.
In the same way that sort of Professor Quatermass, he's a rocket expert, but he soon becomes an expert on whatever is needed to be talked about.
Yes.
Later on, and it's that element where they kind of stretch Conway Henderson a bit, so he becomes a bit of an all-purpose space hero to some extent. Although definitely not in the Flash Gordon sort of. He's very much that kind of British.
I'd just say about Wilson's uniform. He's got, for the costumes that they had, they're quite. Let's put aside the space helmets, because it looks like two coat hangers stretched across a crash helmet. This was purely a practical thing, as I understood it, because they could never get the sound levels, adjusted. But Wilson has this collar. Now, he's dressed very... I don't know if it's Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon, but the style of collar with the studs on is very reminiscent of it. I was going to say about... In Pathfinders to Mars, they seem to have got ski suits on, which I suppose in 1960 would have been looked quite spacey. And, they do seem to have had a little bit more money on the Pathfinders to Mars series.
It does feel like a slicker series from the start. Like you say, the rocket the rocket set is a bit sleeker and more solid, and certainly it gets over in the first one, because in the first Pathfinders in Space, when the expedition gets in the rocket, they look like they're going off for a walking holiday in Northumbria.
Yes.
It's all chunky knit sweaters.
But again, there's a great imagination to it. And one thing I really liked about Pathfinders to Venus is that on the first episode, there's a sort of, they're in the observation room, and the camera zooms in through the observation hatch. Now, for that period, with the bulky cameras, that was a slick operation, especially if it was being done live, to get that smooth transition. Yeah. Even today, it's difficult. But on the latter end of that series, when they're walking through the jungle and it's been sort of, it's smouldering from the volcano eruption, even the branches are smouldering. And I found that very eerie and very effective.
I think Guy Verney does an excellent job, especially when you consider the strictures that he was working under.
Yeah.
There is quite a bit ambitious. He gets in spacewalks. Like I say, the Martian landscape is quite impressively put together, and he manages, even though it's obviously a pretty small set, he manages to keep finding new ways to point the camera at it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things, they were restricted, weren't they? Because, we're fortunate, as I say, we've got bigger studios now. We've got lighter equipment. We can put people into smaller spaces and make it visually look a lot bigger. And a lot of people like Gerald Flood and all the others who came into the series were all from theatre backgrounds. And Unity Theatre is where Eric Pace and Malcolm Hulke met. And this was a very controversial... I think it was really a good thing that they met together, because they knew they wanted to try new writing, new ways of doing things. And yet there was an old guard, if you like, saying, oh, no, we don't want this. We don't want to see this. So television was the natural transition for a lot of theatre people, where they had more scope. They were doing different things. They weren't... If you were in a repertory theatre, which... sadly doesn't really exist much in this country, you were probably given the same roles week after week with just different lines. I'm not saying this is entirely true of TV, but ultimately Unity Theatre was breaking the mould. And later on, you get people like Joe Autumn, because 68 is the pivotal moment where people are allowed to do exactly what they want. They don't have to have approval. The only approval you need is from your audience. Again, in television history, 53 is coronation year. People start buying TVs. People are buying into this. So, Pathfinders is a breakthrough in terms of it was exciting to watch. It was different. People hadn't seen this before.
Just coming back to the point you made, which was very good, about TV stopping more or less. There were still some experiments going on in 39 and coming back in 45. One of the huge advances that took place in that time was aerial reconnaissance, that we needed photos of bomb damage and we needed target photos. So the work on lenses was huge during World War II. And that greatly helped TV and film when they came back online in the post-war period. And their lenses were much sharper and much better.
That's very interesting. I'd never thought of that before, but I think that makes a lot of sense. That does.
In the first series, there's a bit of separation overlay, and it's done twice. Once and again in Pathfinders to Mars, they tried the same thing. Obviously, it was a bit too much for the technical crew to handle because they're sat on the chair and they're suddenly floating about, and you can obviously see that there's a bit of, I suppose, disturbance where part of the leg is missing.
Yes.
It doesn't entirely work. But for that period, 1960, it was absolutely amazing for a viewer to watch.
Because they do that during the spacewalk sequence when they're going between spaceships.
We forget, we just take it for granted that it's an easy thing. It wasn't an easy thing in those days to do. So I came into it thinking, oh my goodness, this is really not going to be very good. I think where Pathfinders to Venus falls down a bit is having cavemen. Again, you've got to sort of suspend belief and think, well, okay, they've got to have some other element to keep the story bubbling along.
Definitely Venus is the one where they kind of, even though apparently they did a lot of research, as they always tried to, but at that time not a lot was known actually about Venus. At that time, we hadn't sent any probes there. We just knew what we could see through our telescopes. So they definitely take advantage of that, the fact that we didn't know a lot about Venus. And some people did genuinely believe that there might be jungles down there. I don't think anyone seriously suggested dinosaurs and cavemen were to be found on Venus.
There is an interesting scene, I think it's at the end of episode 5, when we first see one of the Venus jungle people. And it's shot looking into a cave, and this big, hulky, furry Vesuvian steps into shot and stands there with his arms down, looking very menacing. And it reminds me so much of the final shot in Unearthly Child, where they land on this strange planet, and we just get the outline of this Stone Age man standing there.
You must have thought that Anthony Coburn must have thought, oh, that looks good. Nobody will ever know, because they weren't into repeats in those days. No. It was broadcast once, and that was it. It just didn't happen.
It's interesting that the restaging of that scene at the start of the next episode is notably more dramatic. They kind of took advantage of the time. So at the start of the next episode, he's really dramatically backlit at this sort of shambling silhouette in the cave mouth. Which is, in fact, you notice that on quite a few of the cliffhangers, which of course were restaged live, is that they often take a bit of advantage to just give it a bit of a polish. The Lichens, notably, one episode at the end of the cliffhanger, they're basically just tubes. By the start of the next one, we've also got the silly foam. Well,
Which has become a
Looking
staple of
good.
science fiction ever since, you know. If
That's
get the
it.
sun film out, you know. There's so much that we think, oh, you know, we'd never do that again. But, you know, it does crop up occasionally in stuff, you know. And there's continuity errors, but, you know, you can forgive all this because the actual group of actors are pretty... You know, they're pretty solid stuff, aren't they? They can.
Really good. I was going to ask
all the way. Sorry,
I was going to ask you what did you think of the child actors over the course of the series?
Oh gosh, well they say never work with children and animals, but they've. I can't honestly say that they've gone on to greater things, but they are very much out of the acting school of 50s.
Yeah, I was about to say they're very stage school. They all sort of talk. They're all very well spoken, particularly Margaret, Conway's niece, who's introduced in Mars. I thought, are you related to the Queen by any chance? Because she's especially in the first episode. I think she mellows out a little bit over the episodes, but in that first episode, her voice is outrageously posh.
I'm not quite certain I'm pronouncing the surname, but Stuart Gildotti, is it? Who plays Jeffrey.
Mm-hmm.
The guy can't say a line without shouting it. Everything is ultra dramatic.
You took it out. I'm glad you raised that, Brian, because yes, his delivery on nearly every line of, somebody at some point, he had a drama teacher that said, when in doubt, shout. And he goes through it.
Yes.
He goes through it being very, very urgent all the time.
Yes. But where's the sugar for my tea?
It's like, I'm really sorry about that.
You say that, but you see, Gerald Flood always poses and he looks directly at the camera and says this line. Look, Mary, we're in a bit of a tight spot here, but we're going to get through it, oh girl, you know.
I found the girl playing Kiki, who doesn't have many lines. She is the Vesuvian girl that they come across and befriend and desert to this child molester on Venus at the end. But anyway, she had very few lines, all of them made up words, and yet I thought she had a great presence.
She did. I think in some ways she gives the most naturalistic performance. I think out of anybody, any of them. I was slightly worried at first. I thought, have they blacked her up? But I think it's more the case she was meant to be dirty.
I think they had, but then she becomes lighter, especially in the face. In a couple of episodes later.
Yes.
I did.
I always love costume departments because they never look sort of too dirty or too scruffy. Everything's slightly tailored and sort of fitted. And looking at Kiki's sort of furs, they were slightly tailored and well fitted. You know, as much as the costume department said, "Oh no, I'm not having anything that's going to show my work up. We've got to have the best." You know, it's slightly. It does sort of think, well, it could have been better if they'd just done this or they'd just done that. But I'm sure that you want to talk about Harcourt Brown because he is such a villain. I do want to talk
about Harcourt Brown.
He's such a villain.
He is. It's funny. He's in some ways the most interesting character, played by the marvelous veteran character actor George Coulouris. Coulouris, I think it is. Yeah.
And a Manchester lad. Way. So
yes, he is apparently so.
Yes.
Right.
Who is splendid as Harcourt Brown, who for a start he smuggles his power is that Buchan Island is incredibly disorganized. So it's almost unbelievable the way he's able to smuggle himself aboard the spaceship, basically by it's sort of. He kind of arrives. Nobody seems to ask him for any ID or anything. They just immediately shove a space helmet on him and tell him to get in the ship.
Well, it's because he arrives too late. With 15 minutes to blast off.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's science fiction. You know,
it's another one of those credibility stretching moments. Must admit, Harcourt Brown does bring a bit of conflict and danger that probably the series needed at this point. The first series, everyone pretty much, apart from Hugh Evans, who has this moment when they land on the moon. Just before they land on the moon, and he sort of says, he has this kind of panic attack that he has to be talked down from. But apart from that, everyone largely cooperates and gets on, and they're all a team under Professor Wedgwood. So bringing in Harcourt Brown, I think it's an obvious device to bring a bit of conflict into it. First by the fact he's an imposter, and then by the fact that he is quite a dangerous conspiracy nut, as it turns out, who has an obsession with life on other planets.
You do kind of give the game away, though, by calling the episode The Imposter.
That's it. Possibly it works in a sort of bomb under the table kind of that the audience knows about.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's interesting how his development of the character comes up to sort of Pathfinders to Venus, because they obviously get to Mars. It's a bit of a spoiler alert here. No life other than the plastic balloons which wrap themselves around folks. And he has to concede that there's no great city. By the time he's got into the ship, moon rocket, whatever, number 4, and they've gone on to Venus, he's convinced again there's a civilization here, but finds a bunch of cavemen. And you've got to think, well, did they really think his character out as such, or was it just that he was good enough being this sort of rather sinister character who you didn't really trust? Keeping a child locked in the compartment of the rocket for several weeks, that's another interesting thing. I mean, you never saw them eat or drink much or
that is true. Change. There is, and you thought they might have found a thing to put in some those squirty bottles and had a bit of space food. But I suppose again, it's that we're in the very, very early days. Those squeezy bottles with the space food haven't really been invented yet, because so that's why we just got the tea to have.
On the question of life on other planets, I do find it rather odd that in Pathfinders to Mars, there's this huge debate about life on other planets, and yet in Pathfinders in Space, they'd already found artifacts on the moon and a spaceship on the moon, which they piloted back to Earth. So they know there's been another presence, whether it was early humans, as they suggest, or another race. It's not 100% decided. But they know these planetary visits take place.
It is strange that never gets raised again, because that is an amazing discovery. That is seismic. So it is a little bit surprising that it's not referred to again. I found that really intriguing. I think if I'd have watched that as a young lad, I'd have found that would have been the memorable part for me. We get these clues to this alien civilization that they discover on the moon, and these little clues about what they were. We know they were roughly humanoid shape. In fact, we find a body of one, so we know they're roughly humanoid, but we don't really find out much about them. But it is a little bit surprising that everyone is so quick to dismiss Harcourt Brown aboard, because there is a little bit of evidence that there is life on other planets. His journey, actually, and he is a splendid character because he is utterly untrustworthy and dangerous, even at times. Like I say, he takes someone hostage. He more than once tries to sabotage the expedition for his own selfish. And he's dangerous in a way because he doesn't really have a big master plan. Once he's aboard, getting aboard the rocket is probably the most clever. He's like a child in some ways. Everything else is kind of an improvisation
Well, he turns out very much like Cavour in H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon, because once he finds out there's a civilization, he's worried about humanity destroying the civilization when they overexploit it.
That is a nice development of it. In fact, Venus does give him this moment, and I remember watching him thinking, "Oh, I wonder if he's going to change now," because he gets this moment where he comes to he's been looking for this city on Venus that he glimpses early on in the series from the ship. He finally gets there and finds it's basically a big mausoleum. There's nothing there except dead cavemen that they've been burying there. And there's just this moment, and it's probably the only moment when he really the card drops and he's sort of broken and realized, no, there is no great civilization waiting to cure all our problems. And then he picks up this new thing about Venus being the unspoilt frontier that he needs to protect. Going back to Martian Chronicles, one of the early astronauts who lands on Mars has a very similar kind of conversion, and he's quite rightly predicts how Mars is going to be taken over and strip mined and the rest of it. And rather like Harcourt Brown tries to set himself up as a defender of the planet.
This is a recurring theme through a lot of science fiction, though, isn't it? The stripping of resources, decimating other worlds. Yeah. And we're in a situation now where we know that our own resources are drying up. We're looking for renewable energy, etc. And it must have been very much in the minds of people in the 60s, let alone the 50s, where they were forecasting we would not have these materials forever. We would have to go on to other worlds, seek out new, places to live on. And I suppose that was the basis for a lot of books. Like, I'm trying to desperately think of one that isn't the Martian Chronicles. But it does seem to be that there's either the world's been affected by drought, or other factors, or it's been hit by a comet and we're all sort of underground living in shelters. And again, Pathfinders always give hints of these great cities. Again, Harcourt Brown's always hinting at these great, magnificent buildings, isn't he? And he's looking up at, I think it's before the Valley of the Dinosaurs, and he's saying, yes, there it is, the great city of Venus, this is where we're going to find this intelligent life I've been telling you about. And it's just a book, a pile of rocks. Probably just won't say for a lot of people now who want to watch the series. But there was always that hint of a natural disaster which has propelled them to go out and seek out new worlds. One thing I would like to talk about is Trevor Duncan, the music for Pathfinders, because quite honestly, it's like an earworm. Da, 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 da,
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up the music. Actually, what leapt out at me about the music is a lot of the same tracks are used in Quatermass.
Yes.
And later on in Doctor Who as well, in early Doctor Who.
Yeah. I think it was Adrian Bolt, wasn't it, who was conducted the, Marge, da, 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 he was coming in. But then Trevor Duncan's theme for Pathfinders was introduced into that, and yet it becomes the main theme of Pathfinders. And it has a great title, because I looked it up the other day. It's called Challenge of Space. And it seems to sum it up quite neatly.
It does. It has that opening swoop like a rocket taking off. That opening.
Yes.
Yeah. And it does go on for several minutes, the actual composition. And it really is a good piece of composition.
So just a little bit on Pamela Barney, aka Professor Mary Meadows, who's an interesting example of a female scientist who's never criticized for being a female scientist, which you notice a lot of women who appear in 50s science and 60s science fiction, they always have to have this scene where they said, I had to choose between being a scientist and being a woman. And happily, Mary Meadows avoids this.
Yes, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, which is stereotyping, and a lot of actresses were stereotyped into the same roles. Fortunately, Mary is not one of them, and she's quite refreshing to see. You know, in the 1960s sci-fi series, the dynamics of the relationship is quite incredible, because at the end of it, he says, Mary, do you think we could perhaps work together? And she goes, oh, yes, yes. And that's about as far as it goes, other than a quick peck on the cheek. But, you know...
But of course, that quick peck on the cheek, that kiss was one of the written-in scenes for the Cambridge research, because they wanted to see how kids responded to kissing.
Right.
Now that is interesting.
That's the only reason it's in there.
But I mean, the females and males, especially with a lot of American TV, the executives would decide what was appropriate for a sort of middle class, dare say, white family watching a cozy tea time show. So racism, sexuality, any hint of, I suppose, anything going on in the bedroom was strictly out.
Speaking of unsung heroes, I think someone else who deserves a mention is Derek Freeborn, who was the model maker and special effects creator on them, who was brought in. He started off a business making models for conferences and exhibitions and prototypes and that sort of thing, and then through a contact was a mutual friend of Guy Verni's, was brought in to the series, and I think he does a pretty good job, considering that they ask him to do obviously space rockets of various kinds, planet landscapes of the Moon, the Mars, and Venus. There's a sense actually they get more and more ambitious. I think they realise they can push him a bit, and that they can rely on him to deliver. You get.
And being probably what we would describe as freelance, I mean, he probably wasn't privy to any of the sort of screenings, and was told, we want a lunar landscape, we want something that looks like a bit like a jungle with mountains in the back, and he would just have to supply it, and hopefully it would tie in. It's a classic case of not many model shots of this period match up with the actual footage that it's inserted to.
No.
But having said that, I've got to say that the lunar landscape was incredibly effective. You know, it looked very eerie. As the opening shots, it does look really good. Then you cut to the studio and you're thinking, not quite the same here, but nevertheless, it's impressive. You know.
What I thought was very interesting, and to me added a great visual dimension to it, was having the spaceship set designed vertically rather than horizontally. So we kept moving up and down with the characters, and I thought that added a lot to it.
I mean, having that two-level thing was very, and the camera again sort of, you know, well, you'd have a jib and you'd be moving it up and down. Again,
that is very well designed.
And through when they come and land on Mars for the first time, and they're going down the ladder, and that shot of them sort of going through onto the surface, I thought that was very effective.
Yes.
So I mean, clearly it didn't lack ambition. You know, it was. You know, people say, oh well, you know, they just did it and they just sort of, you know, rolled it out week after week. But people actually did think these things. Really, you know, they
did. Sort of like there is. I think that's one of the appealing things about the Pathfinder series. There is a lot of thought gone into it, even if it looks a bit stagey. There is thought gone into it. All has a practical dimension. There's no room here for superfluous fins or on spaceships or anything like that. Everything looked like as they imagined space rockets were going to be like.
There is one cheat, I believe. I could be wrong in this, but I don't think so. Early on in the Venus story, they need to join up with a space station, which miraculously becomes the Russian spaceship by the last episode.
Yes, it's a nice. I quite like the way they subtly establish the alienness of the spaceship that they find on the moon.
Yes.
Just by slightly altering the design so it's all triangles.
Yes.
As opposed to the circles of a human spaceships.
Yeah.
So, which is a nice little design touch, I thought. And also, just a little mention, I thought the rather charming dinosaurs. We mentioned the dinosaurs. I think pretty much spoiled
the Czechoslovakian dinosaurs.
The Czechoslovakian dinosaurs.
Yes,
exactly. From the marvelous Journey to the Beginning of Time, what it translates into English, about three boys who go on a magical river journey back into the past, and they discover dinosaurs and mammoths and all sorts of creatures.
And oddly, that film was made in colour.
It was. It's actually recently been released on Blu-ray in a new restored edition. But they use so they just bought a few clips from it, but it's a rather nice. I'm a big sucker for anything stop motion animation. I'm a big fan of stop motion animation, and it's a nice. I think that perks up the episode rather nicely.
Yes,
because there's not many pre-filmed inserts, is there? Up until Pathfinders to Venus, there's very few pre-filmed inserts of any other material. So it's like a bit like Everything But the Kitchen Sink in Venus. They're throwing everything at it to see what works and what doesn't. Again, as you say, there's some very effective lighting and very sort of good camera techniques. I feel we can't leave it here without saying Hamlet.
Oh yes, we have. Tell us about Hamlet,
which is the guinea pig. But for a couple of episodes only, he gets his own screen credit. It says Hamlet as himself, and then they stopped giving him a credit
because he was getting too big.
His agent wanted too much money.
I think Hamlet might have been substituted a few times because he seemed to be going sort of bigger and sort of, but he is.
Knowing the lifespan of guinea pigs, that does not surprise me. So we're coming to the end now of our little trip, looking back at Pathfinders in Space. So I was wondering if you had any sort of summing up for. I think I'll come to you, Brian, first.
I find it a totally engaging film. Well, a series of series, if you like. I love them from start to finish. They're cranky, they're predictable, they're woodenly staged. There's nothing you won't know before you watch it that you know after you've finished, because you've seen it all before somewhere else. But it's just a damn good mix of juvenile science fiction from the early 60s, and I love it. And if I was giving it marks out of 10, I'd give it 8 out of 10. This is my second time watching my DVD collection, and I thoroughly enjoyed it again.
That's brilliant stuff. And Nigel, because you've only seen this quite recently.
Yes, so... I'm a newbie to it all, really. Well, I mean, I've got to say my favourite moment of Pathfinders is Henderson saying to Jimmy, "Oh, and by the way, Jimmy, here's that screwdriver I promised you ages ago." I'm handing him a very ordinary-looking screwdriver. "Gee, thanks, Mr. Henderson. He's the best." And pops it into the top of his pocket. Now that's British, isn't it? That's real class. Having all those pens and screwdrivers just neatly lined up. It's got a charm to it which you can't describe. It is of its period, but you can sit back, you can have your cup of tea, your hobnob, and you can just relax. And as I said, at the end of it, you cheer them on because you want them to succeed. We could have had... I think it comes to an end quite abruptly. I think there would have been I'm sure there was another series they could have come of
They
Pathfinders.
were planning one.
Yeah,
Uh,
interestingly, Gerald Flood and Stuart Guidotti did go on to play very similar characters in 3 more futuristic thrillers produced for the tea time slot. There was Plateau of Fear, City Under the Sea, and Secret Under the Sea. So, although they are playing different characters, they're playing a news reporter and his photographer in those.
I think what's lovely about it was created at a time when we had a lot of optimism, and people did have this lovely sort of notion of what space and space travel was going to become, and how we were going to be living in these fabulous cities and traveling in these marvelous spaceships. Sadly, it's not happened as we speak, but who knows? Somebody could be watching this podcast or listening to it in the future and saying, my word, weren't they wrong? Yeah. Look at us now. Look at us in this beautiful, gleaming city that Harcourt Brown told us about all those years ago.
I think my favourite moment is dialogue is at the start of Pathfinders in Venus, where Harcourt Brown goes slightly shamefacedly to Conway Henderson and goes, look, what are you going to say about me when we get back to Earth? And Conway sort of says, well, you did try and kill us, but if you behave, but I'll tell you what, if you behave from now on, I'll stand by you.
Yes.
Didn't he have a moment in James Bond when he says, why do you want to kill me? Why do you want to make me kill you, Mr. Bond? I think it's all that's what makes a fantastic buddy, because he doesn't go quite over the top. He sort of plays it straight, and that's the hallmark of not only a great actor, but how to play it when you haven't. Let's face it, it's not the greatest of scripts. They had a very limited sort of material to work with. They had limited time, but they could have gone way, way, way over the top with it. And somehow they managed to keep a lid on it all the way through. And I think that's why it's got this enduring appeal, because it just keeps it at a level that makes it almost believable.
I think it does stand the test of time because it's well-intentioned and it's ambitious. And for those reasons, I can forgive a lot of its contrivances elsewhere. Well, thank you so much, Nigel and Brian, for joining me on this inaugural podcast of Very British Futures. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Music by Chattery Art. You can find out more about his music at chatteryart.bandcamp.com. Produced by Gareth Preston.